Hello and welcome to whiskey.com and whiskey.de. Today we're having a little interview, and my interview partner today is David Vitale, and he is the founder of Starward Whisky, the whiskey distillery. So you have 2 years of experience before you founded the Starward Whisky distillery, and now 15 years already. So it's a little gem, it's a little hidden gem there in Australia. Thank you very much for having us. Thank you very much for coming. That's the way.
Absolutely. Thank you, Benedict. Yeah, it's funny, I still remember the first day a little bit of spirit came off the stills, the first distillation run. But we're still in the whiskey world, we're still a baby. 15 years is a short amount of time.
Oh, in 15 years you can make some good whiskeys. So, for my viewers, how big is Starward? How many stills do you have? How much output do you have?
Yeah, so we have two copper pot stills.
Hmm.
We make single malt. We make single malt.
Hmm.
Especially for the European market, it's very, very much focused on single malts. And so we have two copper pot stills. They're Italian
Oh,
from Friuli. They're amazing stills. And the way we operate, I guess, is very unique in terms of the distillation process. Very few distilleries have. In the copper pot area, a jacket on the neck
oh, you do
of the
have
still.
a cooling jacket.
Yeah. So in fact, actually, I think the Dalmor is the other one that
Yeah.
has a cool jacket on the neck, which is
Mhm.
just behind you, which is funny. But very few distilleries have a cooling jacket, and that's a big part of the reason why our spirit is so delightful and so clean before we age it. But if we go back a step, obviously, or using single malt, we need brewing. We need barley,
Mhm.
and we source our barley from a maltster, which is about 60 kilometers from Melbourne, and they do all the malting for us, and then to our specification. Obviously, we like our malted barley a little bit darker than what would be traditionally the case in, say, a Scotch whiskey distillery or even a bourbon distillery when they're using malted barley for bourbon, just to add a bit more flavor and character. And then, yeah, we've got a standard sort of mash setup, in terms of the mash tun, and then the fermenters. You can actually see over my my right shoulder there. Like you can see the fermenters in the background. They're 25,000 liters in size,
Oh, okay.
so
So
they're quite standard.
the malt, does it come from Australia, or where does the malt come from?
All of the ingredients for Starward come from a day's drive from the distillery. So
Oh,
if
okay.
it's the malted barley, obviously the water, and then the barrels that we source to age our whiskey are all within 1 day's drive of the distillery. So it's pretty fun to kind of talk about, the provenance of whiskey. I think great whiskies around the world always talk about the place they're made. It's such an important part of the story, whether it's Scotland or like Isla's a magical place, right? And the peat that comes from the peated whiskies there is quite distinctive. And for us, I was sort of I wanted to use my imagination to find something that would be um, similar but different. It wasn't to say, oh, we need the Highlands and we need like a
Mhm.
rolling stream by the distillery. Now we'll leave that to the Scottish
Mhm.
romantic people. But it's important to kind of talk to the place it's made, and the ingredients that we use in Starwood are all local ingredients. Yeah.
Mhm. That's really really cool. So the you said the casks also come from the region, but how about the oak? Does the cooperage get the oak from?
That's a good question. So the oak is actually American oak
Oh, okay.
and French oak. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Nice, nice. So I love it. So you have the maltsters who probably are more into beer, and you cling on to that. But I mean, it's the same process. And then you have your fermenters, which are, what was it, 24,000? That's quite a number.
Yeah, it's quite big. So we process quite a bit of malted barley every day
Hmm.
to fill its fermenters. And the idea is that with Starward, when I started making whiskey, as I said earlier, as you mentioned earlier, I spent 2 years learning how to make whiskey in Tasmania, which is an amazing, beautiful place. And so when I started thinking about I want to make my own whiskey, I knew we could do it. I knew we could make whiskey, but the challenge really was how do we move it from something that is a special occasion to something that people can have in their whiskey cabinet every day.
Hmm.
And to do that, you need to make a lot of whiskey to serve the customers. And so, relative to the rest of the Australian whiskey industry, at the time we started, we were the biggest, and we're laying away, a lot of whiskey to support the ambition to be this whiskey that could be everywhere. I'm
Hmm.
in America, and like we're starting to build a market here. you know, um, Europe and Germany and the UK and France are all very, very important markets for us, and we want to make sure we've got enough whiskey. So we started big from day one.
Yeah, it's always to have, it's nice to have a good production because if you come up with something good, then you don't have like small stocks, but you can supply it to more customers. So in terms of your fermentation, how long do you ferment? You go for like fruity one or more grassy one, or how is your wash?
Very fruity. Yeah, it's very fruity. Quite tropical fruits
Oh.
come through the fermentation. So we go quick. It's somewhere between 69 and 72 hours, depending on the day of the week. So that's standard, like sort of fermentation
I would
for
say
for.
it's medium to long, I would say.
Is that right? There you go. Okay, yeah. Maybe I need to the long, in Tasmania, in Australia, a lot of the distilleries go long, like 1 week.
Oh, okay, that's very
Yeah.
long.
Yeah, that's very long. And the idea behind that is that there's a secondary fermentation, which adds a very distinct profile to the whiskey. I come from a brewing kind of passion. So when I started thinking about Starward, it was really to think about where flavor starts, and we know it starts with the grain. And then fermentation was another area that we really focused on driving a lot of flavor from.
Mhm.
So, yeah, 69 to 72 hours. It's a mixture of an ale yeast and a distilling yeast. So,
Oh,
very much lots of flavor coming from the ale side, and the distilling making sure we get all of the alcohol. And then, yeah, we distill it. It's very much like a saison when we're finished with it. Like if you can imagine a Belgian style alembic beer, it's very similar to that when we
okay.
finish with it. Yeah.
Interesting. Do you have trouble with the temperature, or do you have a cooling jacket, or is it?
100%. Yes. So Melbourne, and we'll talk a bit more about this when with aging, but it can get quite hot in Melbourne. If you ever watch the Australian Open tennis, it can be, over 40 degrees on some days. And so we need to make sure that the temperature of the fermenters doesn't get too hot.
Okay.
And for two reasons. Number one is we want a consistent product. That was the other thing that was really important to me. So a lot of whiskey, but also a lot of consistent whiskey. And so because we have this really crazy climate that changes every day in Melbourne, we wanted something that from a fermentation perspective would be consistent every single time.
Hmm.
And so when you pitch yeast, obviously the temperature goes up because they get pretty happy about the fact that there's all of this sugar that they're going to eat, and that generates its own heat. So we just want to make sure that every day that heat, is the same sort of temperature over
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, if you have too hot fermentation, it's pretty nasty with the flavors. So nice. Yeah, I was guessing that you got a cooling jacket. You think you
Yeah.
couldn't go without it. But I've never heard of a ale yeast yet. I've heard a lot of distillers used and yeah, brewers used, and I've even seen some with wine yeast, but I've never seen a ale yeast. So you said it's like a Belgian. What was it? Belgian.
Saison, the beer,
The beer. Okay.
Yeah, and so it's very, very alembic style of beer. Very, very fruity, aromatic, lots of clove character, tropical
Okay.
fruits. We have some banana in the wash. Sometimes people pick up some pineapple, and obviously strong malt character too.
Yeah, okay, so if you have that kind of yeast, you have like 60, 70 hours, then yeah, I think you should end up with that. That sounds
Yeah,
plausible. Okay,
it's
so
very, very fruity. Yeah.
very fruity. Okay, so how big is your stills then, and how's the distillation going?
So yeah, we just upgraded our still. So we have a 7,000 liter wash still
Hmm.
and a 3,600 liter spirit still.
Okay, you're way above craft distillery, but you're one with the smaller distilleries.
Yeah, so we're sort of in the middle. And this was a big step up, this last upgrade, which we did a year and a half ago.
Mhm.
And before that, the spirit still was actually our wash still, and we had an 1,800 liter wash a spirit still. So
Ah, okay.
they kind of have grandfathered up, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's funny because the 1,800 liter spirit still was originally our original wash still.
Oh, you did a second upgrade now.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
good.
yeah,
Okay, nice, nice. And so with the distillation, so where you going fast distillation, spicy, fruity, or you're all going with fruity style?
yeah. We love fruit. I think it's a wonderful kind of character profile to have in the spirit, particularly with the style of whiskey we were looking to make, which is very approachable, easy, obviously smooth, but just something that was on the approachable side of things. And so um, we figured that fruit would be a really good friend for new whiskey drinkers coming
Hmm.
along to kind of identify in the spirit. So, I think of all of the aspects of our distillation, of our production process, maybe the distillation is the most standard, like that's where we kind of do things in a traditional way. But,
Hmm.
you probably understand with the brewing and the fermentation's very different. And then obviously the aging of the whiskey is very different too, the maturation. So, but the distillation is very much two copper pot stills. Um, we run them for about 6 hours
Hmm.
end to end, and then again in the second spirit still, we want that clean flavor to come through, and so we've got a jacket on there, and that also is important for us because we do experimental batches of single malt. Often they're called
Hmm.
projects.
Hmm.
About that later on, but having a jacket on the neck means that we can either have high reflux stills, like effectively make the still very tall, or low reflux stills by turning off the water and then having them come down. So it can be telescopic,
Hmm.
instead of making still shrink and grow, we just add more cold water to create more reflux, a lighter spirit, or less reflux, a heavier spirit.
Hmm. I've also had other distilleries that turn their cooling jacket on and off. Do you have like for your main products, do you have like one final spirit, or do you do like different kind of spirits with that
It's pretty much,
possibility?
yeah, it's the standard spirit that comes through from a single malt stream. It's one spirit that we kind of target and focus on making very consistent from batch to batch.
Hmm.
Um, we would do experimental grains, so we might run some mesquite smoked single malt barley, or
Hmm.
something that might be a little bit different, darker colored grain. But it's always single malt, and but 95% of the production from the stills is very, very, very consistent.
Ah, okay, you have 95% is your core product, and then you have these 5% which goes into experimental and all these kind of
Yeah.
other stuff. Yeah, I like it. I like it. But you said you have experimented with smoky malt. Is there anything coming up or?
Yeah, so we have the second release of our peated finish whiskey. So this isn't actually peat smoked malt barley. It's the standard. It comes from the 95% whiskey, but finished in an Islay cask.
Ah, okay.
So you get those lovely. It's a very delicate and hint of smoke flavor, not dominant smoke flavor. Which is, my middle daughter, her name is Isla, so I love peated whiskies. But, we want to make sure that we always have something that is approachable and accessible and introduces people to whiskey in an easy way, not, poke you in the eyes,
Okay, nice. But because usually I've seen distilleries where once they've tried a bit of peated whiskey, and usually they don't go away from that. Usually they don't have like peat weeks of 2 or 3 weeks a year. So
yeah.
Maybe.
It's something that's becoming a bit of a collectible for Starward to do the peat whiskey, because it's so usually we're more on the delicate side. So to do peat is something that's a bit of fun, and it's still a delicate whiskey, but very not Starward.
But it would be quite difficult for you to source it or to purchase it, a peated malt, because is there a peated beer in Australia?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the single malt, the malted barley that we get comes from a brewing maltster, and they don't want smoke anywhere near that malting. Right? So if we were to do it, we would have to either malt it ourselves and infuse smoke into the barley, or buy it from overseas. And we think that there's other ways we can innovate and be really interesting to drinkers with our aging, particularly. So using Australian red wine barrels is a big difference for Starward compared to other distilleries.
Yeah, let's talk about your maturation. That is probably one of the most interesting things about your climate, right?
Yeah, so climate is a big deal for us. I mentioned the Australian Open before. It can get up to, when you're watching the tennis, it can, the people are sort of like having sunstroke and need to stop playing tennis because it gets so hot in Melbourne. But it can also change very quickly. So, it can be high 30 degrees Celsius and then be in 25 minutes go down to 15.
Whoa.
It's very, very, very dramatic. Everybody knows that we've got the big desert in the center of Australia called the Outback, right? We're all familiar with the desert in the middle of Australia, but we also have a desert to our south called Antarctica. And so if the weather is coming from the north, it's very hot and dry, but if it's coming from the south, it's very cold and humid. So we have these two very dramatic impacts on our climate in Melbourne, and it happens very quickly. So, in 3 Melbourne years, when we age our whiskey in Melbourne, after 3 years, we evaporate, 15, sometimes 20% of the barrel, which is the equivalent of, maybe 8, 9, 10 years in Scotland, or 6 or 7 years here in America. Yeah.
Oh, that's brutal. That's brutal. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but it's a good thing too, because what it means is that we obviously have more whiskey available sooner to share with everybody, which is great. And I think that we've learnt over the years now how to kind of adapt the barrels and which barrels work for Starward and which barrels don't work for Starward in terms of that climate, which is really, really important.
Yeah. So in terms of, you said your climate changes very fast, because I would have actually guessed, because I only know the desert as the Outback, and I would have guessed that you had like one season that's just hot. Does your barrel work like you have in Kentucky, or does it work like multiple times a year, or how does that affect it?
Look, the joke is that we have 4 seasons in one day in Melbourne. So and it can be quite dramatic, but they work very hard. They work very, very, very hard. Like these are, if you think of Kentucky whiskey, they do have 4 distinct seasons a year. Like there's a very hot summer, which is humid, and then a very cold winter, snowing, you know. And so we don't quite have the seasons that Kentucky has, but we do have the temperature range, you know, that really does impact on the spirit, which is a good thing. You know, you need time in wood. That's good whiskey takes time, you know. But in Melbourne, things just happen a bit faster, you know.
Okay, very nice. And in terms of like how many casks do you already have in warehouse over the last 15 years?
Yeah, we now, you know, there's tens of thousands. I can't keep count in the bond store, but we, you know, we have the largest whiskey aged in red wine barrels in the world, which is pretty exciting for us because that's all we use. You know, if we talk about Starward, you can't say Starward without saying aged in red wine barrels. You know, like it's such a big part of our DNA and our story. And so we source these barrels from that one day region, you know, from the distillery, and that's very important because the way that we age our whiskey is with wet filled barrels. So this is wine goes out, and then the unaged whiskey goes straight into the barrel, like and often within 24, 48, maybe 72 hours. So we have to work with our wine partners that have got these barrels to source them quickly, get them to the distillery, and then fill the barrel. Otherwise, we start making vinegar aged whiskey, and trust me, vinegar aged whiskey is no good.
Okay, I understand. So
Yeah.
is the wine cast like your standard maturation that you start with?
Yes, yeah,
Oh.
full aging in red wine, full aging in red wine. And so it's a very different approach, and we can do it because these winemakers are so close. And so when I started thinking about aging in red wine barrels, the tradition, you know, the tradition with whether it's American whiskey or Scotch whiskey is to make sure that there's the barrel has been charred before you use it. Shaved, toasted, and charred. You know, that's kind of the model for sherry and port, and obviously American whiskey has to be charred by law. So when we got these wine barrels, we did what everybody did, which is to char them, and they're delicious, but they're very big, very, very big. It's like drinking the Aussie Shiraz of whiskey, you know, like big whiskeys. And for my idea of where we wanted Starward to be, it was too big. And so what we did was said, well, what can we do here? Why do we need to char these barrels? Because it's creating a lot of intensity, you know, a lot of intensity as well as complexity. And so we thought, well, what if we just fill them wet and see what happens? And a lot of people were like, you're crazy. It's going to be too tannic, too much tannins. Because when you age whiskey without the char, what does the char do? The charring on the firing of the barrel creates a carbon filter for the spirit to interact with, so it cleans the spirit up. But also it softens the oak so that it's sweeter and a lot more enjoyable. The characters from the oak are sweeter. So that was the normal approach, is you need to char it because it softens the barrel and creates a filter for your spirit. We didn't worry about the filter for our spirit because we worked very hard in the distillery before we aged the whiskey to make something that's very delicious. It's you can drink it. It's like a barley schnapps, you know, delicious. So I wasn't worried about it needing time to become more flavorsome or like to clean the spirit up. You know, as you said earlier, we were very careful with fermentation to make sure we don't get any funky flavors that we then need to clean up later on. So we weren't worried about the filter side, but we were concerned about the soft aspect of the oak. We wanted to make sure that it was delicate and easy. And so when we started aging whiskey in red wine from the beginning, wine out, whiskey in, no charring, we were very surprised to find that the whiskey was softer than the one where we char the barrels. And the reason for that is winemakers use barrels to extract tannin from the oak. The winemaker in the wine, right? So that it can cellar for tens of years. It can, say in your home cellar for 10 or 15 years. It needs oak for structure, the wine. So all of the tannin that would otherwise make the whiskey not very delicious is in the wine. It's not in the whiskey anymore. And so the way that American distilleries and Scotch whiskey distilleries use fire to soften the barrel, the wine has softened the barrel for us.
Ah,
It
okay.
makes a barrel, yeah, because of extracting all of the tannins into the wine. And so what we end up with is delicious wine flavors, but also very different oak flavors because it's never been charred. And so we have red wine barrels that are French oak, American oak. They can be 300 liters, 200 liters, 100 liters in size. Some of them are charred. Like we do still char because that intensity on some like gives the blenders at the distilleries some different flavor profiles, some light whiskey, some, heavy whiskey. And, beyond that, we then age, we source our barrels from distilleries making Shiraz, Cabernet, Pinot Noir. And then, at the winery, it might be one vintage and then it comes to Starward, or it could be a few years at the winery before it comes to Starward. And so when you kind of create the family tree of Starward barrels from red wine, there's nearly 100 different types of barrels that are all red wine barrels, but give us distinct flavor profiles that then the blenders can marry together to create, our wonderful whiskeys, the wonderful single malts that you guys love over there.
Okay, so I was always wondering why distilleries don't use wine casks that much because wine casks are probably pretty good available pretty well, aren't they?
Oh yeah, in Australia for sure. I mean, there's so many wineries making amazing wine that it's great because also because a winemaker is usually going to use the wine barrel for more than one vintage, the quality of the barrel, say compared to a bourbon which is only used once at the Kentucky distillery, is the oak is a lot thicker in a wine barrel too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've heard
Yeah.
that. I've heard that. Also with the sherries are also thicker. Yeah. So, very, very nice. So how many wineries do you work together with?
Yeah, when we first started, it was like, I'll take a wine barrel from anyone. You know what I mean? Because it
Okay.
was, if they were making good wine, we would take the barrel. That was kind of the idea. But then when we learnt is that not every good wine that's seen a barrel makes a good Starward barrel.
Mm-hmm.
We had to be a little bit more fussy, not because of the quality of the wine, but because of the wood policy at the winery. I'll give you an example. If you're making a Shiraz at a winery, you will turn over your oak frequently because you need lots of tannin in the wine.
Mm-hmm.
So you turn the barrels over fast. That's good for us because there's wine and whiskey is very different alcohol, so we can extract a lot more of the generous flavors from those wine barrels. If you're cellaring a Pinot Noir in a barrel at the winery, you might use that barrel for 5, 6, 7 vintages before you sell it. Because really, the Pinot doesn't need a lot of oak. It just needs to rest and have a slight character. So the Pinot barrels are going to be less intense in oak flavor compared to the Shiraz barrels.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we need to make sure that when we work with our wine partners, that the wood policy that they're using, how they treat their barrels, what they've done with the barrel beforehand, we have a good understanding and it fits the profile for Starward. So in our blending team, in fact, are winemakers. They come from their history has been working in wineries, so that we can have a very good understanding of how they've treated the barrel before it's come to Starward.
Okay, very, very nice. So now we've produced the whiskey and matured the whiskey. So, what kind of whiskey product range is available at Starward, and what would you recommend beginners?
Yeah, so look, I think the thing that we are really proud about at Starward is that, whether you're a brand new whiskey drinker that's learning about whiskey and don't really know or care about the production process, or whether you've got 500 whiskeys at home, we've got something very interesting for you to talk about. Because if you love to, like me, I'm very passionate about whiskey, spelled both ways. Anywhere around the world, I'm hooked. I love whiskey. And so for me, I want to know about the fermentation temperatures and the still size and the how we kind of craft the spirit. And because of the unique approach, we've got this wonderful portfolio of whiskeys that can really be interesting to those whiskey experts. But at the same time, because we think about whiskey from the drinker's point of view, of something that's approachable and accessible and easy to easy to kind of to drink, we've got something for them as well. So my favorite of the single malts, I think, is Left Field. It's 100% French oak aged whiskey in red wine barrels. It's a very accessible price point. It's like the sharing cabinet at home. It sort of sits alongside the Glens from Scotland, or the maybe not the Jack and Jim, but one step up from the bourbons as well. Just something that you can say, okay, I'm going to give this a try because it's not going to break my wallet, and that's the starting point with Left Field. French oak is an amazing oak style to age whiskey in, because it has a lot more of those spicy characteristics coming through. Not hot spice, more baking spice characters. So cinnamon, nutmeg, a little bit of pepper in there as well from the wine character. And then with our fruity spirit and the red wine characteristics, it's just a lovely, easy drinking, very, very delicious whiskey that you can have neat. And we win awards around the world all the time with our whiskies, and they're sampled neat, but also there's enough complexity in the whiskey for it to be used as a highball or in a cocktail like a Manhattan or an old fashioned. So Left Field is always my go-to, particularly if I'm in Europe. I can't get enough of it because it's a lot of fun. We don't make enough of it, for example, to come to the United States. So you guys are really lucky in Europe to have it exclusively. And then the next whiskey, I think that, really started for us the journey into red wine, is called Nova. And this is a mixture of those, 60, 80 barrels, those different types of barrels brought together. So American oak, French oak, some of them charred, some of them not charred. There's 300, 200, 100 liter barrels all married together to create this wonderful, complex, deep, luscious whiskey. So that's Nova. It's a step up. And then the third whiskey, which is actually the original whiskey we made at Starward 13 years ago when we launched, is called Solera. And Solera is really interesting. It's actually fortified Australian wine, like sherry. But obviously sherry comes from Spain, and this fortified wine is called Apera, like aperitif. And Apera is like a, mostly like a cream sherry, I would suggest, like something like a bit, the creamy style of sherries. And we sourced hundreds of those barrels from a winery that was closing down very early at the distillery. And then every year we've been working to build up the inventory to the point at which now we actually make our own Apera to season the barrels that we're going to use moving forward. There's not enough Apera barrels for us to be able to serve the global audience. So that's a bit exciting. I never thought we would become winemakers at the distillery as well. So that's a bit of but the Solera system is something that's done in fortified wine barrels. It's like the pyramid of barrels, you know, and you fill from the top and empty from the bottom. And over time, the barrels waterfall down. And we do the same thing, but instead of a big pyramid of barrels, what we have is a Solera vat. Very similar, if people are familiar with the Glenfiddich 15-year-old. It's a similar system. And what we do is that vat has never been emptied. So we have got 5,000 litres of spirit that's aged, ready to go. And that's what we started with in 2013. When we launched, we had 5,000 litres of aged whiskey in the Solera vat, but we only released 500 litres from the vat. Mm-hmm. And then with the next release, we added from the bond store another 500 litres of aged whiskey, and then took out 500 litres. So every barrel we've ever emptied of Apera is in that Solera vat.
Ah, so you do have a little bit of a proportion from the first whiskey in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's nice. It's very romantic, you know, to say, actually, I'm drinking the very first barrel that David ever emptied at the distillery right now. And, it might be like just a drop, but it's in there, you know, and it will be in there forever. And so I love that idea. And the reason why we did that was actually for consistency, because 90% of the whiskey that you're drinking is exactly the same whiskey from the last batch. And then what we've done is topped it up with extra whiskey from the bond store. And because one of the things I think early on, Benedict, I learned from being a whiskey drinker was that I love craft distilleries. I think that they're so inventive and so, you know, passionate about what they do. But often, and this is not about quality, they're all well-crafted whiskies, but they're very different from one batch to the next. And I wanted this whiskey to demonstrate that craft distilleries can actually be very consistent too. And so the way that we did that was by creating the Solera vat that we aged the whiskey, that we effectively hold the whiskey in before we release it. We don't do that with the red wine barrels because we have very deep inventory to make a consistent product. But with Solera, because we don't have a lot of inventory because no one's drinking sherry anymore in Australia, we take this approach. So there's about $1 million worth of whiskey ready to go that we could sell tomorrow, but we never will, you know. And so it's my $1 million promise to consistency to drinkers. Okay. So that's Solera. That's my favorite. It comes and goes. It's on allocation. So if you see it in market and you like it, I would buy it. This is my shameless plug. Because it's very different. You know, it's sometimes can be a while before the next batch is ready. Mm-hmm. But it's not kind of fun to kind of have the different batches so that over time you can then understand the differences that over time have happened with the product.
Okay, so very nice. So 15 years you do have, and you say you have produced all the way through. Nice to have such a good inventory. That always pays off in the future.
Yes.
Yeah, so is there anything like what you want to do in the future? Is there anything coming up with Starward?
I'm really excited. I think the thing that, you know, one of the wonderful things that, because we're so young and because we're still learning, we're always doing experiments at the distillery, whether it's, you know, that 5% different malts that we're working with, or maybe a different barrel that we found from a winery or not a winery. We might age in ex-bourbon barrels or a port barrel or a sherry barrel. There's always something interesting coming from Starward. We call them projects, Starward projects. And these are experiments that sometimes don't work at all, and then sometimes win lots of medals around the world, but there's only 2,000 bottles and that's it. You know, so it's a lot of fun. And, you know, I think if your viewers register on Starward, starward.com.au, they'll keep up to date with what's available in their region. That's number one. But one that's coming out at the end of this year is that we are going to be celebrating our 15th anniversary. And we have a limited release coming out. It is unbelievable that what we've done is basically taken a cross-section of all of our whiskey in the Bond store. So this is, if you are mining, it would be like a core drill, just one sample of all of the types of barrels we have in the Bond store. So we have some rum barrels, we've got some ex-bourbon barrels, we've got some Apera, some red wine, we've got all of these different types of, we've got the tawny barrels in there, the port barrels, and so all married together into one release. The last time we did this was for the 10th anniversary, so this one comes out November of this year. So that's definitely one that if you like collecting whiskies and like something really different and something that's you know, has a lot of complexity to it, not intensity, complexity. I think you're going to love that one.
Yeah, I always do love the like triple casks, and there's even some other whiskeys out there with a lot of different oaks and the types of casks where you have different staves of different oaks. I do love it. So yeah, it's probably gonna be a nice whiskey then. Yeah, hopefully I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, so I think I have one question left. So as a founder, that is always such a exciting position. What was your inspiration to create a whiskey? What was your motivation?
You know, it's a great question. Do you know, I think I mentioned before, my love really of whiskey came from beer. And growing up, you know, I live in, you know, I grew up in Australia, but my family is Italian. And so, you know, whiskey wasn't part of my childhood. It wasn't part of like things that I saw or anything like that, or, you know, my dad or uncles or aunties drinking. We, you know, Italians drink wine, you know, that's kind of what we did. So the only thing we used to do is give a beautiful, you know, because it's in a beautiful box. I remember our accountant every year that did our taxes used to get a bottle of Chivas Regal 12. Like, that's a memory in my mind, a beautiful silver box. And, you know, thank you for helping us with our taxes. That was given to the family accountant. But that's my memory of whiskey. So I love beer. I love craft beer. And when I discovered single malts, I realized that these are basically the craft beers of the whiskey world. That, like, you know, different distilleries have got different styles, that, you know, they've got amazing stories to tell, and that, you know, there's a wonderful connection. And I fell in love with whiskey, but from a craft beer perspective. And so I thought, you know what, if I'm a craft beer guy and I've fallen in love with whiskey, maybe other people can too, you know. And that got me excited that maybe whiskey wasn't just this thing 15 years ago. It's changed, right? But 15 years ago, maybe it wasn't just this thing for people that, you know, have a you know, tweed jacket and a pipe and, you know, like an old hand sort of thing. But actually, it can be a modern drink for curious people that maybe don't even know they like whiskey yet. And so that got me excited. And I thought that, you know, Starward could be a modern whiskey for a curious drinker that, you know, that wants to explore whiskey differently, you know, that, you know, and do it in a way that's still respectful of like Scotch, bourbon, Irish and Japanese whiskey. It's not saying that, you know, I love all of those styles, but then also to say we can kind of arrive and be equally as interesting as those whiskeys, but let's forget about history and heritage and tradition and actually embrace innovation and modernity and, you know, food and a modern culture.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. So very nice. And yeah, that hopefully bright future. I think you will, because if you experiment and if you keep up the quality, you always will. So yeah, thank you very much for the interview. Thank you very much for showing us the in-depth for the Starward.
Absolute pleasure, Benedict. And if you're ever in Melbourne, please look us up. And anyone viewing, please please come to the distillery. We'd love to show you around. It's an amazing space.
Yeah. So yeah, and to you viewers out there, thank you very much for watching and see you next time.